Been meaning to make this video for a while, but we're finally going to do the series spotlight on the Chronicles of Thomas Covenant, the Unbeliever. Hello and welcome to my channel. In this video, we're going to be talking about the Chronicles of Thomas Covenant, the Unbeliever by Stephen R. Donaldson. Just the first trilogy, which consists of Lord Fal's Bane, the Ill-Earth War, and the Power That Preserves. I still love that I have these. These are some really old school hardcovers that I actually got from Andrew. Before this, I had a kind of an older box set that I liked here too. I'm going to put them back because I can just see this big gap here right next to me, and I want to fill that in. But we're going to be talking about this series because this is a series that I absolutely loved, but it's one that I had a lot of mixed feelings on. And there's also a reason why I've never done a why you should read video for it, because it's one of those that I feel like is going to so depend on you as the reader, if it's going to work for you or not in a lot of ways. And it's also a controversial series for very legitimate reasons. And so I feel like this was a good excuse to go back and talk about this. This also did win. I did a poll, and it was close. I had quite a few votes though, and Thomas Covenant was the winner. So I've been meaning to get to this. I mentioned it a little bit sooner, but we're going to get into it. So talking about this series, we'll first kind of talk about what it's about, what the premise is, and then go into the good and the bad. We'll talk about, including the big thing, that if you're familiar with this series, or if you ever bounced off of book one because of the thing, we'll talk about the big thing specifically because it is completely understandable why people bounce off. But we'll talk about it. But anyway, let's start with talking about this. So this series is following, of course, Thomas Covenant, and this is a portal fantasy, but it starts out being written just like kind of, contemporary literary fiction. It's Thomas Covenant is a leper, he has leprosy, and these are, older books, and it's taking place in a time where there's still a huge, huge stigma on it, and so he's just kind of, cast out of society. He lives on his own, and people are like, trying to get him to not even come into the town he lives near. His wife has left him, took his kid, and it's just his life is not good. He's very bitter, and he's kind of like, just because he's so bitter about it, he's going into town to pay his phone bill in person, because even his bills, people started paying his bills just so he would not come to pay them in person, basically. And so he's just kind of doing that just to spite everybody, and he's an angry, bitter person. Life has dealt him a pretty crap hand, but you also you're dealing with that sort of character. And so he then has a weird encounter with a vagabond, and then finds himself in the land where he is being looked at as the potential savior. The problem is he doesn't believe that any of it is real. So that's kind of the description, and it gets into both, I think, some of the things that make this really interesting, good and bad, which we'll talk about. But the first thing I want to talk about here is the way that this story is written in, because of the two different sorts of storylines here. So with having it be portal fantasy, we start off with the more, lit fic kind of style, which is excellently written. And when I first started reading this, because I really didn't know anything about this series when I picked it up, it was a random pickup for me. I'd heard of it, I think, but I'd never knew really nothing about it. And I would absolutely read a series that is just about this character dealing with leprosy. And it's so well written, it's very compelling. And so, although the character is very unlikable and will make himself even less likable as you go along, it's compelling and it's written really well. So it's almost to the point where, as a reader, you feel like it's jarring going into the fantasy world, which sounds like a negative, but it's because of the way the storytelling takes place. You're kind of feeling what Thomas Covenant feels. He's very jarred by this. So are you, in a way. And so I think it's really positive. And then it's the land, which is just called the land, really, that he's in, is one of the big positive things, I have to say. Now, fans of this series, I've heard say many times, hate Thomas Covenant, love the land, and we'll get into Thomas Covenant, the character, as well. But the land is just this beautiful, in many ways perfect thing. It's the people are one with the land. There are these types of like great berry things that just grow, and like you can just eat them. They're the most perfect thing, and they're very nourishing. There's so much rich history and lore, and everything about the land is just amazing and beautiful. And the Stephen Donaldson's prose and the way he describes it is also beautiful, which that's another one that we'll get into as well, because the writing style will not work for everybody. But if you are the kind of person who really enjoys beautiful prose and descriptions and writing style like that, where it's elevated, you're going to have a good time with the writing, I think, or at least appreciate it, I would say. But the land is the big selling point here, and so I think it is interesting. Me as someone who's often been more focused on world building than many people. World building is kind of my favorite thing. It's why I fell in love with the Wheel of Time when I was younger, and what got me into fantasy in general. And so I really like when there's a lot of world building done. And the land is full of so much life. Quite literally, it's just like abundant with life. And the different characters, there, we have our lords, we have the whole political structure, we have giants, we have all kinds of different landscapes, places, history, including I there's like a historical figure who's called Kevin, and that always gets me, I will admit. It shouldn't be on either side, but he's called Kevin, and he's like historical from this fantasy book, and everybody has fantasy names except for Kevin. But that it always made me think maybe Kevin also came through a portal at some point. At least in the first trilogy, that's never stated or confirmed. But yeah. So anyway, sorry, I didn't mean to get on another tangent, but that one always gets me and just makes me laugh. But anyway, so the land is just beautiful and rich, and there's so much to just absolutely fall in love with. If you're somebody who really likes falling in love with the fantasy world, it's so easy to do here. And you have that contrasting with the character of Thomas Covenant, which is where really the storytelling, I think, shines in the dual nature of the story. The themes here, the philosophical discussion that are explored in this series, which there is quite a lot of, and you have this character who is surrounded by this abundance of life, and it's somebody who's coming from the main world and is just absolutely bitter. His body is literally decaying. He is now in this world, and so the contrast there is not something you normally see. This is not your typical story. A lot of the kind of the feel of the land and the battle does feel a little bit Lord of the Rings, but it's explored in such a different way because of the main character. It changes everything, and the fact, of course, that it's portal fantasy as well. It just changes so much. So looking at that and the themes, the villain is called Lord Val, the despiser. He's just this basically kind of force of evil, and he wants to corrupt the land and destroy the land. And Thomas Covenant is the person who can potentially stop that if he actually decides that he wants to, because the initial philosophical question that's brought up in the first book before he's transported is, if somebody doesn't believe that the world they're in is real, are they a coward if they don't act? That sort of thing, which is not a direct quote for the record. It's that kind of general idea. And something also is explored is, are you responsible for your actions if you don't believe it's real, what's happening around you? If you don't believe what's happening is real, are you responsible for your actions? Are you a coward if you act or don't act? And we look at both of those with the consequences to Thomas Covenant's actions, as well as the consequences of inaction versus action, which is something that we look at, especially in book 2, the inaction versus action. But it starts with that sort of premise, and I think that's an old school fantasy thing where we're starting with that kind of thing and we're going to explore it. It's also something that I feel like old school sci-fi really did, where it had like, hey, this is our premise. We're like, what if this was the case? Now we're going to explore it. So we've kind of done that in an exploration of these themes in a fantasy setting. So if that sounds terrible to you, this may not be for you. But if you're like, oh, that's really interesting, this is something that is, I think, going to be a good read for that reason. It's something that, for me, I found myself, even when there were things I had issues with, And fun fact, I did do a review for actually all 3 of these books way back. One of them being one of my earlier videos of all. 2 of them don't have video, 1 does. And they're also the 3 different styles. The first one for Lord Fowl's Bane is when I used to just do stream of consciousness reviews. The second one is fully scripted, and I can tell because I went and re-listened to them to refresh myself with some details. And the third one is closer to what I do now, but still is a little bit of a different feel. So that was just kind of fun going back and listening to them. So I'll link if you want to see my really old reviews where like quality's bad, but the thoughts there are still pretty valid. But it's so anyway, sorry, but looking at them, I had a lot of issues with the first book, and I was very mixed, but I was so engaged and it really made me think. And I going back and seeing my initial thoughts shortly after reading the books, I had some mixed things. There's still one big thing I don't like in book 2. But it's just looking at these ideas, they're so fascinating to explore. And then book 3, I think in so many ways, brought everything full circle. And it shows you why the things happened the way that they did. And it really kind of brings it in. And there's still some things that I, debated on and was engaged. But it's the kind of book that really does engage you, that really makes you think while also just having... It's beautifully written, the storytelling is phenomenal, and it is unique. And so those are some things that I think are really on the good. Now we do need to talk about the bad, because there is plenty there to talk about, and it's something that I think is really important to be aware of if you're going to try this series, to know if it's even worth checking out because of some things that happen. So the first thing, and I sort of mentioned, the writing style is not going to be for everyone, because as much as I can say, like, oh, it's beautiful prose, the descriptions, the imagery is very vivid, Stephen R. Donaldson also likes to use, like, obscure vocab words, as the Library Ladder had a video talking about Stephen R. Donaldson, and would talk about this a lot. Apparently, it gets a little bit more worse later on, especially in the last one, the last set in this series, which I've not read. But so he uses a lot of obscure words, and you're gonna find this is one of those books where you're gonna find words you don't know, unless you're like an English scholar or like really familiar. Because I'm pretty well read, and a lot of things I remember just being like, I've never seen this word in my life before. So you're gonna get some of that. So if that sort of thing, if you've struggled with denser prose or more like elevated prose or things using like archaic or unique words, if that's something that bothers you, this is probably not going to be a series for you right off the bat. If you are, on the other hand, somebody who really enjoys that really nice prose, that sort of thing, this may be something that you enjoy because you absolutely are going to get that. But the big thing, which I've sort of, it's funny because it's all so wrapped up, the good and the bad with this series, and which is why, despite the fact that I do think it's a masterwork as a whole, the trilogy, I had so many mixed feelings as I was reading it, especially in the first 2 books. But a big thing is Thomas Covenant, the character. I know people who this seems like going to be a really great fit for, but they just can't get over Thomas Covenant, the character, because he's incredibly unlikable. If you need to like your character, this is not going to be a great series for you to read. If you... if you like really want that connection, and I do think I will say you can connect to some of the feelings that Thomas Covenant is having, because we all have times where we're feeling despair or we're feeling hopeless or getting into these types of situations, and so you can maybe with some of the things that the character is feeling you can relate to or connect with, but it's so hard because Thomas Covenant is by design an incredibly unlikable character. And despite the fact that he does have a disease and, has some reasons for being the way that he is, he's not a good person. He's angry and he's bitter, and that comes across in all of his interactions. He's constantly complaining. He's constantly saying things aren't real. He's argumentative. And he's just, all he wants for the most part in these books is to just get out of this world that he doesn't believe is real. And it's the conversation of whether or not it's real goes back to the themes, the philosophy, and everything, where I could still go either way after really thinking about it, talking about it, reading other people's thoughts on it as well. But it's that sort of thing is something that's going to make it hard for people, because he's not a character that you can like. And so I absolutely get it if you are like, oh, I don't like unlikable characters. I feel like these days, though, with Grimdark being popular, kind of gray, unlikable characters are becoming a little bit more accepted, as well as some content concerns, which we're going to talk about here in a moment as well. And yeah, we're going to get into And so I feel like it's something too where people might be a little bit more open to this with the way that reading tastes have evolved in some cases now, which is why I think it's a good time to talk about it. So we need to talk about the big thing, which is the essay that happens. I'll try to say this so I don't get in trouble by YouTube, but very early on in the first book, the interaction is when Thomas Covenant goes into town. He sees some like young women or teenage girls or of some sort. I don't remember what age they are, who are like, you know, dressed with not a whole lot, and he just has these thoughts of like feelings of impotence because due to his disease he's not able to do anything like that, and so he's just like, he's frustrated, and it's that feelings of impotence really play a lot into this as well. And then very shortly after he arrives in the land, there's a teenage girl who's there, and he ends up forcing himself on her, and that's a thing that happens. Now, totally get if that immediately it makes this like, I'm not going to read this. I totally get it, because I saw that and I debated on if I was going to finish or not. At the time, I never really DNF'd books, so this is one of those books that after reading the whole thing, I'm really, really glad I did, but it makes me wonder would I have noped out of it at that point too. So I totally do get it, but it's something that's not it's not like that happens. It is a one-time thing that happens, but it's also something that is incredibly significant to the story, and Donaldson does not just sweep it under the rug and forget about it. Now, in the first book, it does feel like it's not really focused on a lot, is the thing, too. There are some big things that happen that make it relevant, but it's not something that comes back fully until the next two books. But that particular action is something that the consequences of it, the long-term consequences, are very much explored in the rest of the series in some heartbreaking ways and some incredibly emotional ways, and that play in with the themes as well. So you will get the exploration of it. It does happen for a reason, and there are other forces at work also that are pushing events in certain directions in some ways as well throughout the series, on both sides really. And so that kind of it comes back to matter, essentially, is what I would say. It's not done as just something to be shocking. I think at first it's meant to be shocking, and it's meant to be an appalling thing. And while you can have sort of the explanation of why it may have happened, and it goes back to the, well, if you don't believe it's real, is it wrong? And that's kind of the play. So I think it's really giving you a huge example of that dichotomy of, is this still wrong even though he doesn't believe it's real? It was him just being full of life all of a sudden, because he has leprosy, but when he gets to the land, his body like comes back alive. So he has vitality that he feels, and he's overwhelmed by it. And then that's something that we see kind of throughout as well, where he's almost hates it because he knows he still has this disease. He's saying this isn't real. He knows at some point he's going to be back in his own world, and all of it's going to come crashing down. And that's where a lot of the bitterness comes from. So it's, once again, I get hard to read. I know that sort of thing is surprisingly common, too common in my opinion, in a lot of books these days. So I don't know if maybe that's something that people are more open to reading that. But all I can say with it is, if you're just like, I don't want to read it, it's fine. I totally get it, 100%. I don't care for that type of content myself, but it matters, and it is a very pivotal moment in the series. It's something the long-term consequences are explored, and it's not just done to do it. It's not done repeatedly or anything like that, but it happens. And I know that's the really big thing that has been made the series extremely controversial right off the bat with that type of thing. And so I want to bring that up and make sure that I talk about it, because it is important to know. And I want to give you the whole point of this series spotlight is I'm trying to tell you the good, the bad, and if ever there was a series where there's a lot of good and a lot of bad together, this is probably one of them. And I kind of want to focus more so series like this where there's a lot of things on both sides, where I'm not just like, oh my gosh, read this, this is phenomenal. This is phenomenal. I do recommend it if what I talked about in the first section sounds appealing to you, and if what I talked about in the second section has not turned you off of it, because I do think this is going to be very much not for everyone. And I read a lot of books that are not for everyone, and it can be a little bit more niche. This one is a little bit more obvious as to why. In both ways, whether it's the writing style, the content, the character. This is something that's just simply not going to work for everyone. And once again, that's completely okay. But it is really just beautifully written. The storytelling, the themes, the philosophical discussions through the narrative, the dual storytelling where we're seeing what's happening with our main character and when we're seeing what's happening with the land and the land itself, which is just one of the most beautifully described and just full, rich worlds in fantasy. There's a lot to love here, although there are still some issues as well. But I hope this video has been illuminating for you and kind of making you understand if this is going to be a series that you want to check out if you haven't, or was some interesting discussion if you have read it and just kind of wanted to hear my thoughts on it. Either way, but that is my series spotlight for Thomas Covenant. Make sure to give the video a like if you enjoyed it. Check the link in the description as always for my Patreon if you are interested in supporting me there, as well as the Wizardly Enclave Discord if you want to chat books, whether these books, other books, really anything at all. It's a lot of fun and we'd love to have you. And of course, if you enjoy my content, make sure to subscribe.